Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is Dr. Cormier. I'm a plant-based doctor, plant-based athlete, practicing medicine and lifestyle medicine out in New Brunswick, Canada, on the east coast of Canada. I've been doing medicine for 15 years and I've been plant-based for more than a decade. I'm a world qualified athlete and I'm on a mission of having people put more plants on their plates. So as you might have seen on my introduction video, I'm going to wing it and talk about plant-based nutrition straight off the top of my head. The goal here is to edit as little as possible because in the hopes of making my videos perfect, I was just ending up not making them at all. So I'd rather kind of wing it and start putting some content out there and see where all of this goes. So right on. So today, the first video that I wanted to talk about is simply putting healthfulness of food on a spectrum. One of the questions that I typically get is, are eggs healthy? Is milk healthy? And that's a very nuanced question that needs a nuanced answer, right? No food is inherently good or bad in terms of healthfulness. All foods fit on a spectrum. So we'll talk about the spectrum and how it can help you make more guided food choices. Now, if we're looking at foods in terms of heart outcomes, cardiovascular disease, cancers, risk of neurodegenerative disease, allergic and immune conditions, and the main chronic diseases that plague our society, we can pretty much fit them on a spectrum of which of these foods are associated with protection or are associated with an increased risk of developing these diseases. So inherently, food is not either good or bad, it fits somewhere on a spectrum. Now, if I talk specifically about junk food and I talk about donuts and chocolate bars and pizza, most people would say, well, these are probably not health foods and would typically put them on one side of the spectrum. If people talk about beans, chickpeas, and lentils, or apples and oranges, most people would put them on the other side of the spectrum, stating that they're likely healthy. I think everyone would agree with that, and that's not highly debated. It's everything in between that kind of gets complicated because people try to fit their dietary patterns in certain camps. And typically, this creates friction when talking about the different dietary patterns associated with each different camp. I myself eat a plant predominant diet, and I think I eat like that because of the scientific evidence tends to point that way. So what I'm saying is that most studies show that if you increase the amount of calories you get daily from whole unprocessed foods, you live longer and you get healthier. I don't think anyone is debating that, right? After a few years of my journey, I decided to transition to a 100% plant-based diet where 90 to 95% of my foods are obtained through whole foods, but there are still space for some ultra processed foods in my diet. I don't think that the science promotes a 100% restrictive whole food plant based diet. I do have a social life. I do go out and eat and do occasionally indulge. But I did choose later on in my whole journey to restrict animal products and seafood, dairy, and eggs to a minimum, and now they're at zero. So if we start about to talk about the processed food spectrum from ultra processed foods on one side and whole foods on the other, we can kind of see where the foods fit on that spectrum. So let's start with the ultra processed foods side of the spectrum, where we can find anything from junk food, chocolate chip cookies that you buy in at the store, donuts and muffins and cake, and pizza, and these foods are typically ultra processed foods, and I don't think anyone disagrees with me saying that they're typically unhealthy when overconsumed. Now, let me start by stating that any food can be part of a healthy dietary pattern. It's just a matter of the dose, all right? So, eating too much of unhealthy foods can be a problem, but getting a small amount of your calories from the occasional ultra processed foods is not the end of the world. And that's not the reason that people have chronic diseases, because they ate one cookie at one point in the day. It's what we're putting on our plates 80 to 90% of the time, day in, day out, over the long term, that determines our health outcomes. So let's start about talking about the ultra processed food spectrum. Ultra processed foods are associated with higher rates of chronic disease of all sorts. And some studies show that depending on the country, we get from 50 to 60 some percent of our calories through ultra processed foods. Now, ultra processed foods are designed to be shelf stable and palatable and super tasty, and they typically are foods that have been chemically and physically modified from their original state from which they came from. And chemically, some things have been removed to increase shelf life, like fiber, and some things have been re-added to increase shelf life, like preservatives and additives. So ultra processed foods are probably the unhealthiest of all foods. I don't think anyone disagrees with that. After that, we'll see ultra processed meats, which are classified as a class 1 carcinogen by the World Health Organization. And there we'll find processed meats like pepperoni, salami, bacon, ham, slices, deli slices, sausages, bologna, franks, and jerkies. So these meats have been highly processed to make them shelf stable and tastier, and are directly associated in a dose dependent fashion with increases in cancer and chronic disease. So the unhealthiest foods would be ultra processed foods. Then we'd find ultra processed meats. Then we'd find red meat. Now, red meat is associated with cardiovascular disease and the increased rates of cancer, certain types of cancer, and are classified as a class 2 carcinogen by the World Health Organization. Now, red meat does contain protein and does contain iron and certain micronutrients. The question, we're not debating whether or not they contain good nutrients. We have to also consider that they also contain cholesterol, saturated fat, heme iron, and a lot of other things that you don't need. The question is always, could you get these same nutrients from healthier sources that are further down the spectrum? So after red meat, we would find white meat that typically is associated with less health impacts, negative health impacts, than red meat is. And after that, you'll find fish, dairy, and eggs. And after that, you'll find whole plants. Now, the question is always, are eggs healthy? Now, it depends on what you replace them with. If you're eating red meat for breakfast and you're switching that for 2 eggs, your health parameters are likely going to get better, because there are a lot of positive nutrients in eggs. There are a lot of unwanted ones like saturated fat and cholesterol that may in IGF-1 that you don't want. But just keep in mind that replacing foods with other foods that are further down the health spectrum is typically a positive choice. Now, if you replace your eggs with oats, with whole oats, that's even better. You're moving towards more whole plants, more nutrients, more fiber, and less saturated fat, less cholesterol, and typically your health parameters get better. So it's not a matter of, is a single food good or bad? It's always a matter of, if you're not eating that food, what are you eating instead? And are you eating a food that it's on this side of the spectrum or that side of the spectrum? Now, on the far right side of the spectrum, you'll find whole, unrefined plants like nuts and seeds and whole grains and legumes and fruits and veggies. And no one argues that eating more of these foods increase lifespan and health span, meaning that you'll live longer and you'll live better for longer with reduced rates of chronic disease. So kind of keep in mind that you can't go wrong eating more plants. And most studies show that by trending towards more plants and increasing the amount of calories that you get from whole foods, your health parameters get better. Um, Now, also recognize that each of these food groups, and I call them food groups, obviously they're not official food groups, but I subdivide them that way to make them easier to understand. Each of the groups, ultra processed foods, processed meats, red meats, white meat, fish, dairy, and eggs, and whole plants, exist on a spectrum, but inside of that, each individual food group lies a spectrum as well. And I'll give you an example. If you're talking about whole plants, well, you can eat whole peanuts, and then you can make homemade peanut butter, and then you can buy store-bought peanut butter, and the processing increases because store-bought peanut butter contains additives and added salt, added sugar, and added oils, and preservatives to make it last longer. Now, whole peanuts and homemade peanut butter or minimally processed peanut butter are healthy foods, very healthy foods, when compared to the store-bought one. Now, I'm not saying the store-bought peanut butter is the devil. I'm just simply saying that everything exists on a spectrum. Just in the same way that you can buy an apple and then you can make mashed apple, then you can make apple compote, and then you can have an apple flavored drink filled with sugar. And at the end of the spectrum, that's no longer a real apple, right? And as you're trending towards more processing, health parameters get worse. So the most important thing is to also always to try to eat minimally processed foods in a state as close to their natural state as possible. I think no one argues that the science is pointing towards less processed is better. But that doesn't make all types of processing bad. Processing also exists on a spectrum. Now, processing can be physically modifying foods like blending, cutting, freezing, blanching, freeze drying. It can also be adding things to it to make it tastier. So if you use whole peanuts and you simply bake them with oil and salt, oil is a processed ingredient and salt is a processed ingredient, but adding those to nuts will make the nuts more processed, but doesn't make the health qualities of the nut go away, right? It's just you add calories and you add sodium that maybe are not as positive for health, but doesn't take away that nuts in any form are healthy. So it's and processing can be adding ingredients. It can also be adding ingredients that are highly processed. It can be adding additives, or it can also be removing ingredients from your food, like taking whole plants and make, like corn, for example, and making high fructose corn syrup. The end product is nowhere near close to the nutritional value of the product you started with. So the most important thing is that a lot of nuances exist when talking about food and their healthfulness on a spectrum. Foods go from unhealthy to health promoting, depending on where you are on the spectrum. And inside of each of these food groups, certain foods are better. If we take the fish or the seafood food spectrum, eating lower on the food chain seems to be better when talking about the accumulation of pollutants and heavy metals that exists while going up the food chain. Certain types of seafood seem to be a little bit healthier than others. And that can be applied to all of the different types of food groups that I mentioned. So don't see food as inherently good or bad. See food and its healthfulness on a spectrum. Try to aim for 80, 85 or more percent of your calories coming from minimally processed whole foods. And that doesn't mean that you can't eat processed foods. I'll give you an example. Before a run, I'll sometimes have white pasta for a quick increase in starches so I can build some glycogen stores and fuel my 20-kilometer run. Ultra processed foods used in that situation is not the end of the world. It's actually a great source of quick, immediate energy. But when you're getting 60% of your calories from ultra processed foods that are sometimes devoid of fiber, devoid of nutrients, and very difficult to stay in a calorie maintenance while consuming them, that's where over time you'll run into problems. So I don't appreciate anyone with an extremist view of things. I think that any food can be part of a healthy dietary pattern. I personally choose to be 100% plant-based. I didn't at the beginning. When I ate for health, I was eating about 80 to 90% plant-based. But once I saw how easy it was and how I loved it and I loved the recipes, and I read up on the other benefits like reducing my carbon footprint, and when I watched documentaries and read on the animal agriculture and how to reduce animal cruelty, I connected with these two new causes, and I decided to go 100% plant-based. I mean, I have no regrets since, and I've been thriving on a plant-based diet for over 10 years. I have quite an origin story if you've not heard it before. I'm sure I'll talk about it again, but plant-based nutrition gave me my life back, and that's why I'm sitting right here in front of you talking about it. So food is not black or white or good or bad. It depends on what you are replacing it with. So I do eat the occasional birthday cake. It's just that mine is plant-based or vegan. And that could still be part of a healthy dietary pattern. It's what you're doing 80 to 90% of the time, day in, day out, over long term, that will dictate your health outcomes, not that one meal that you're eating. Just in the same way that eating broccoli once a month is not going to make you healthy, eating a cookie here and there is not going to make you unhealthy. Right on. So my goal is simply to improve nutrition literacy and hopefully help you on your way to a healthier diet. Thanks so much for listening. If you've liked this video, please let me know. Please comment. I'm bilingual, so I'll certainly be making French videos. Let me know if you'd like to see more of those, and let me know about any subject you'd like me to tackle. I want to focus specifically on people that want to transition towards a plant-predominant diet. This is a judgment-free zone. Whatever you're starting from, wherever you are, my goal is just simply to help you trend towards more plants with one video at a time. Pardon my stumbling and mumbling. I am pretty much just winging it, script-free, and trying to make minimally edited videos so I can get more content out there, because in the hopes of being perfect, I was simply getting nowhere. All right, cool. Thanks for your attention. Pleased to meet you all virtually. Take care, and until next time, peace.